Chapter 20. Mental and Moral Influence of the Medium. Does the development of medianimity depend on the moral development of the medium? No. Strictly speaking, the medianimic faculty depends on the organism and is independent of the moral nature. This, however, is not the case as regards the use made of medianimity, which may be good or bad according to the moral qualities of the medium. It has always been asserted that the medianimic faculty is a gift of God, a grace, a favor. Why then is it not the exclusive privilege of the good? And why is it bestowed on persons who are unworthy of it and misuse it? All faculties are favors for which you should be grateful. But you might just as well ask why God grants good eyesight to malefactors, sharp wits to sharpers, eloquence to men who use it for evil purposes. It is the same in regard to medianimity. Unworthy persons are often endowed with it because they need it more than others, and in order that it may aid their improvement. Do you suppose that God refuses the means of amendment to the wicked? On the contrary, He multiplies those means about them at every step. He places them in their hands. It is for those to whom they have been given to profit by them. Was not Judas endowed as an apostle with apostolic gifts? God permitted him to be thus endowed, that he might afterwards see more clearly the odiousness of his treason. Footnote: the treason of Judas was not the result of a predestination, which would have been in contradiction with the justice and goodness of God. Judas was the reincarnation of a spirit, though proud and presumptuous, was desirous of advance, and had demanded in the state of erraticity to be permitted to take part in the special work upon the earth for which its protecting Christ was then preparing, a participation from which he hoped to reap a rich reward. In vain did his spirit guides dissuade him from attempting a trial which they saw to be beyond his strength. In vain did they warn him that the influences of the fleshly life would obscure the remembrance of his aim and his good resolutions, and would at the same time rouse his instincts of envy and cupidity, and that he would thus be drawn into a failure all the more disastrous from the obstinacy to which it would due. He rejected their counsels and persisted in his demand. Christ foresaw that the terrible experience which Judas was preparing for himself would complete his purification from the evil qualities which were keeping him back, and he therefore acceded to his request. The humble position of terrestrial life into which this proud, envious, and sensual spirit was born, as a condition of the trial he had so unwisely elected to undergo, weighed heavily upon him. Blinded as he was by the veil of materiality, he could not understand the respect and admiration with which the celestial envoy was regarded by all who approached him, and his jealousy of the Master gradually assumed the form of hatred. Tempted by his craving for luxury and sensual enjoyment, he robbed the common purse of which he was the custodian, and betrayed his Master for money. The interpretation of the Gospels hitherto received has represented Judas as having been predestined from his birth to do these evil deeds, and as having been given over beforehand to the devil. His soul, according to that interpretation, had been created vile, abject, envious, luxurious, ungrateful, sanguinary, for the express purpose of fulfilling certain prophecies of the Old Testament. How much more consistent with the justice and goodness of God is the explanation we are now charged to give you of the treason of Judas, as having been, on the one hand, the result of the pride and presumption of the spirit still too backward for the trial he had persisted in attempting, and on the other hand, of a permission which had only been granted him in order that, through a failure which was foreseen to be inevitable, he might be cured of those imperfections, once and forever, by the misery he would thus have brought upon himself. Will mediums who misuse their faculty suffer in consequence? The hand of the medium having written the preceding statement, was suddenly controlled by a new influence under which it again wrote as follows: "How great is that being who makes the very crime of the wrongdoer to become the starting point of his regenerative career of repentance and purification. How good is that being who is always ready to forgive the sincerely repentant, whose beneficence sustains him under the sufferings he has brought upon himself by his wrongdoing, and who leads him on to deliverance through the reformatory influences of expiation and effort. Glory to thee in the highest, O my God." Judas Iscariot. The hand of the medium, after writing this message, was again controlled by another influence and continued thus: "The love of God is extended to all his creatures. Let all those who have gone astray return with confidence into the path which leads to him. They will all be welcomed. Those who have wandered most widely, even more warmly than the rest, for it is not the innocent who needs forgiveness, it is not the strong who need help and support. Let all who regret their wrongdoing commence at once the work of self-amendment and pursue that end unwaveringly, as we have done. They will be aided and sustained as we have been. For like all of you, we have been guilty, but we have repented of our wrongdoing and have expiated through painful and repeated efforts the crimes we have committed. In the long series of human existences which have prepared and accomplished our purification, we have cured ourselves of the defects to which we had succumbed. Our judge is just, but his justice is paternal, and his judgments are always proportioned to our powers of endurance. He makes us pay to the uttermost farthing all that we owe him, but he is a patient and merciful creditor and gives us all the time and all the help that we need for paying our debt. Judas has achieved his regeneration through the purifying action of repentance, remorse, expiation, reincarnation, and progress, and he is now one of the humble, active, devoted auxiliaries of Christ. His rehabilitation should show you that you must never shut out any one of your brethren from your help and kindness, nor regard him as being excluded from the ultimate attainment of the purity and happiness for which you are all being educated by Providence through the trials and discipline of human life. End of footnote. They will be punished doubly because they possess beyond others the means of enlightenment. He who, having the use of his eyes, fails to follow the right road, is judged otherwise than the blind man who falls into a ditch. Some mediums receive communications spontaneously and almost constantly on the same subject, on moral questions, for example, or certain faults. Is this allowed to occur for any special object? Yes, for their own enlightenment in regard to the subjects so frequently treated of, and to cure them of the faults thus pointed out. It is to this end that spirits constantly speak to one of pride, to another of charity. For there are natures that need this incessant repetition of warning and advice to open their eyes to a perception of their own defects. The medium who misuses his faculty through ambition or selfishness, or who disgraces it by some glaring fault, such as vanity, egotism, levity, etc., is surely to receive from time to time warnings from the spirits about him. But unfortunately, he often fails to take such warnings to himself. Spirits are often extremely cautious in their remonstrances, and make them indirectly in order to leave the greater merit to him who profits by their homilies. But there are persons so blinded by pride and self-conceit as not to recognize their own portrait, even when placed before their very eyes. Nay, more, if a spirit gives them to understand that the picture is meant for them, they get angry, which shows that spirits are right to act with caution in their endeavors to moralize those to whom they address themselves. But are not cases in which a homily is thus dictated to a medium in a general way without its being intended for him and in which he merely serves as an instrument for the instruction of others? Undoubtedly, the advice we give is often intended for others, whom we can only address through the intermediary of the medium. But he too might sometimes reap benefit from the lesson, if he were willing to do so. Although you are right in assuming that the mediumnic faculty is intended not merely for the moral improvement of the medium himself, but for that of all mankind. We regard a medium as an instrument, and we prize him as such, but without regarding him as being individually of any more importance than other people. And accordingly, as we give our teachings for the general good, we make use indifferently of any medium who offers us the requisite organic conditions. But you may be very sure that the time will come when good mediums will be so common that superior spirits will be able to choose their instruments, and will no longer make use of mediums of inferior mental and moral advancement merely because of their mediumnic organism. Since the moral goodness of a medium keeps away imperfect spirits, how is it that false or unseemly statements are sometimes transmitted through a medium who is morally good? Can you look into all the recesses of a medium's soul? Though not vicious, he may still be frivolous, or may be but imperfectly cured of some defect, and he may need an occasional lesson to keep him on his guard. How is it that superior spirits permit persons endowed with great mediumnic power, and who might therefore do much good, to be the instruments of error? Spirits try to influence all mediums for good, but when mediums persist in following a wrong road, we leave them to themselves. We use mediums of slight moral advancement, but reluctantly and from lack of better ones, for we know that truth cannot be duly transmitted by a liar. Is it absolutely impossible to obtain good communications through a medium but little advanced in point of morality? Such a medium may sometimes obtain good communications, because if possessed of good mediumnic faculties, the higher spirits may use him, as we have just said, under particular circumstances, or for want of a better. But they will only make a momentary use of him, and will give him up as soon as they find another whose moral qualities suit them better. Remark: it is to be observed that when superior spirits see a medium becoming, through his moral delinquencies, the prey of deceitful spirits, they almost always bring about incidents which show up his faultiness, and thus prevent serious and well-intentioned inquirers from being taken in by him. In such a case, however great may be the faculty of the medium, his exposure is not to be regretted. What are the qualities that would constitute a perfect medium? Perfect? Alas, you well know that perfection is not to be found upon the earth, and that moreover, if it were, you would not be in it. Say rather a good medium, and that is saying a good deal, for good mediums are rare. The perfect medium would be one whom evil spirits would not even dare to attempt to deceive. The best your earth can furnish at present is he who, sympathizing only with good spirits, is least often deceived. If a medium sympathizes only with good spirits, why do they allow him to be deceived? Good spirits sometimes permit deception to be practiced even on the best mediums, in order to exercise their judgment, and to teach them to discern the true from the false. And besides, however good a medium may be, he is never so perfect that he has not some weak point which lays him open to attack, and so he now and then gets a lesson. The false communications which he receives from time to time are warnings not to think himself infallible, and not to give way to pride. For the medium who obtains the most admirable communications has no more reason to be proud of them than an organ grinder who should grind out the most splendid music by merely turning the handle of some unusually well-constructed barrel organ. What are the best conditions for ensuring the correct transmission of the communications of superior spirits? Good intentions, and the renunciation of selfishness and pride. Both these conditions are essential. If the communications of superior spirits can only be correctly transmitted to us under conditions so difficult to secure, does not this difficulty constitute an obstacle to the propagation of truth? No, for light always comes to those who are willing to receive it. The darkness you have to dissipate results from impurity of heart. Get rid of pride, cupidity, uncharitableness, and good spirits will help you to light, even without the aid of ostensible medianimity. Let all who, not having a medium at hand, are desirous to obtain enlightenment, use their own reason in learning more and more of the infinite power and wisdom of the Creator. They will thus give the best evidence of their sincerity, and that sincerity will ensure to them the occult assistance of spirits of high degree. Although a medium, as such, is only an instrument, he nevertheless exercises a very considerable influence on the communications from the spirit world. The communicating spirit is obliged, in order to communicate, to identify himself with the spirit of the medium. And as this identification can only take place in proportion to the sympathy, the affinity, to borrow the expression of Erastes, existing between them, it follows that the soul of the medium attracts or repels disincarnate spirits according to the degree of their similitude or dissimilitude. Thus good mediums attract good spirits, and bad mediums attract evil spirits, because the moral qualities of the medium necessarily determine the kind of spirits who communicate through his medianimity. If a medium is vicious, inferior spirits come around him in crowds, taking the place of the good spirits who may have been evoked. The qualities that attract good spirits are kindness, goodwill, single-mindedness, love of the neighbor, and detachment from earthly things. The defects that repel them are pride, vanity, selfishness, envy, jealousy, hatred, greed, sensuality, and all the passions by which man attaches himself to matter. All moral imperfections are so many open doors, giving access to evil spirits. But what brings us most often under their influence is pride, because it is the defect which of all others we are least apt to recognize in ourselves. Pride has been the ruin of numbers of mediums endowed with the highest faculties, and who but for that defect might have become equally remarkable and useful, instead of which their pride, having subjected them to the domination of deceptive spirits, their mediumic faculties have been first perverted, then annihilated, and in more than one instance such mediums have brought upon themselves the most humiliating retribution. Pride shows itself in mediums by unequivocal signs, to which it is all the more necessary to draw attention, because it is the defect which more than any other is fatal to the veracity of their communications. Pride puffs them up with a blind confidence in the superiority of the communications obtained by them and in the infallibility of the spirit from whom they emanate, and leads them to disdain whatever does not come through their own medianimity, and to look upon themselves as having a monopoly of truth. Dazzled by the great names unscrupulously assumed by the spirits who communicate through them, their self-love prevents them from seeing that they are deceived, and causes them to repel all advice and to keep away from everyone who might open their eyes to the reality of their position. Even should they condescend to listen to advice, they pay no attention to it, and resent as a profanation the suggestion of a doubt as to the excellence of their familiar spirit. They are offended by contradiction or criticism, detest those who warn them of their delusion, and gradually withdraw into an isolation in which they become the sport of obsessing spirits who make them accept the most glaring absurdities as something sublime. Thus, a blind confidence in the communications made through their agency, contempt for those that are made through other mediums, an overweening confidence in great names, repudiation of advice, angry rejection of all criticism, estrangement from those who would give them disinterested counsel, belief in their own infallibility. Such are the distinguishing signs of pride in mediums. It must be admitted, however, that pride is often excited in a medium by the injudicious flattery of the persons about him. If possessed of faculties at all remarkable, he is sought out, cried up, and courted, until he comes to look upon himself as indispensable, and affects an air of self-sufficiency and superciliousness when condescending to lend himself to his work. We have more than once had cause to regret the praise we had given to certain mediums for the purpose of encouraging them. In contrast to the class of mediums just referred to, let us turn to the picture of the really good medium, one in whom we may safely confide. We will suppose him in the first place to be endowed with a faculty sufficiently developed to admit of the free communication of spirits, unimpeded by physical difficulties. This being premised, the next thing to be considered is the nature of the spirits with whom he is habitually in communication. And for the ascertainment of this point, we must rely not on the names they give themselves, but on the tenor of their communications. We must never forget that the sympathies which a medium conciliates among spirits are in direct proportion to what he does to attract the good ones and to keep off the evil ones. Believing that his faculty is a gift bestowed on him for good, the true medium neither prides himself upon it nor makes any merit of it. He accepts the manifestations made through him as a blessing of which he should strive to render himself worthy by modesty, kindness, and goodwill. The proud medium takes credit to himself for his medianimity. The good medium is rendered more humble by his intercourse with superior spirits, because regarding himself as unworthy of such a favor. The following remarks on this subject were made to us by a spirit whose communications we have already quoted several times in the present work. As we have told you, mediums as such play but a secondary part in the work of spirit communication. Their action is that of the electric machine, which transmits telegraphic dispatches from one point of the Earth's surface to another point. Thus, when we wish to dictate a communication, we act on the medium, as the telegraphic clerk acts on his machinery. That is to say, just as the action of the telegraphic needle impresses on a band of paper, thousands of leagues away, the signs which produce the dispatch, so, by means of the medianimic apparatus, we transmit athwart the immeasurable distances which separate the visible material world from the invisible immaterial world the communications we are permitted to make to you. And just as atmospheric influences act upon and sometimes disturb the transmission of a telegraphic dispatch, so the moral influence of the medium acts upon and sometimes disturbs the transmission of our dispatches from the world beyond the grave, when we are obliged to transmit those dispatches through a medium who is sympathetically or intellectually opposed to their tenor. This opposing influence is, however, often annulled by the energy of our will, so that messages of higher philosophic import and elevated morality are sometimes conveyed through mediums but little fitted for their transmission, while on the other hand, very unedifying communications are occasionally intruded through mediums who are grieved and ashamed to have been used for their transmission. But notwithstanding these occasional exceptions, it may be affirmed as a general proposition that incarnate spirits attract disincarnate spirits of similar nature and advancement, and that spirits of high degree rarely communicate through mediums who are bad conductors, when they have at hand good medianimic machinery, that is to say, good mediums. Mediums who do not understand the responsibility of their mission attract frivolous spirits, whose communications are commonplace, shallow, incoherent, and heterodox from the spiritist point of view. Mediums who are used as penholders or mouthpieces by pretentious, presumptuous, or deceptive spirits sometimes say very good things, But for this very reason, spirit messages must always be subjected to severe and scrupulous examination. For in the midst of these good things, hypocritical and perfidious spirits often artfully introduce false statements, calculated to mislead their auditors. Every doubtful word and sentence must therefore be stricken out, and only what is in accordance with reason or with the principles of Spiritist doctrine already laid down and accepted should be preserved. Communications of the nature we are considering are only dangerous for isolated Spiritists, or for groups of Spiritists who have recently taken up the subject and are but little enlightened. For in societies whose members are more experienced, the jay gains nothing by putting on peacock feathers, and is sure to find his borrowed plumage speedily stripped away. I do not speak of mediums who take pleasure in evil communications. Let us leave them to the congenial society of cynical spirits. Fortunately, communications of this order are rarely made in serious circles, and at all events can excite only contempt and disgust among the members of serious and philosophic groups. But where the influence of the medium is really of great importance is in the involuntary substitution of his own ideas for those which the communicating spirits endeavor to suggest, and still more so in the building up of baseless and fantastic theories in accordance with his own opinions or prejudices, whether as a product of his own mind or derived from the suggestions of ignorant or mocking spirits. When in doubt, abstain, says one of your oldest and wisest proverbs. Admit only what is supported by evidence. When any new idea is brought forward, however specious it may appear, subject it to the test of reason and common sense, and reject unhesitatingly whatever is in opposition with them. Remember that it is better to repudiate a dozen truths than to admit a single error, for upon that one error you might build up a whole false theory, only to see it crumble away like a pillar of sand at the first breath of truth. Whereas, though you should reject the true idea when first presented, and because it does not seem to you to be sufficiently proved, some indisputable fact or some irrefutable argument will ere long afford you the necessary proof of its correctness. Meanwhile, O Spiritist, remember that nothing is impossible with God and with good spirits excepting the triumph of error and iniquity. Spiritism and its admirable doctrine are now so widely diffused that spirits of high degree are no longer compelled to employ mediums of defective moral quality, and therefore, if any medium gives just ground for suspicion, by unseemly conduct or manners, by pride or uncharitableness, repudiate alike both him and his medianimity, however powerful the latter may be, for in all such cases there is a snake beneath the flowers. And with this piece of advice, I conclude my dissertation on the moral influence of mediums. Erastes. Chapter 21. Influence of Surroundings on Spirit Manifestations. Is the action of medianimity affected by the quality of the spirits with whom a medium is habitually surrounded? All the spirits who surround a medium influence him for good or for evil. Can the higher spirits neutralize the evil tendency of the incarnate spirit who serves as their interpreter, and of the inferior spirits by whom he is surrounded? Yes, when they consider it useful to do so. We have already said that spirits are sometimes enabled by a special favor to transmit a communication correctly despite the imperfection of the medium and his surroundings, but in such cases the influence of the latter is nullified by their action. When people seek to obtain manifestations merely as an amusement, do higher spirits sometimes respond to their evocation in order to lead them on, if possible, to more serious thoughts? Superior spirits do not go to circles where they know that their presence would be thrown away. We willingly go to circles of which the members are but little enlightened, provided we see them to be animated by a sincere desire for light, even though we know that we shall find only inferior instruments among them, while we do not go to meetings of more educated persons if we see that they have been brought together by a sentiment of hostility or of scorn. Such persons must be convinced through the eyes and the ears, and that is a work which must be performed by the rappers and the mountebanks of the spirit world. It is fitting that those who are puffed up by what they call their science should be puzzled and baffled by the least scientific and least advanced of the people of the world, so contemptuously ignored by their science. Is access to serious meetings forbidden to inferior spirits? No, they sometimes attend them in order to profit by the instructive communications received in them, but they are obliged to remain silent, like ignorant listeners in the assemblies of the wise. It is a mistake to suppose that a man must be a medium in order to attract to himself the beings of the invisible world. Space is peopled with spirits. They are always around us, always beside us. They see us and watch us. They mingle in our meetings and follow or avoid us, according as we attract or repel them. The mediumnic faculty has no influence in this respect, for that faculty is only a means of communication. After what we have said respecting the causes of sympathy and antipathy in spirits, it will be easily understood that we are surrounded by those who are in affinity with us, whether our state be one of elevation or of degradation. If we consider the moral condition of our globe, we see what must be the character of the vast majority of the wandering spirits about us. And if we take each country separately, we may judge by the ruling characteristics of its inhabitants, by their occupations, and by their moral and humanitarian sentiments, what sort of spirits are most intimately connected with it. Keeping this indication in view, let us imagine a party of gay, frivolous, unreasoning people busy only with what they call pleasure. What kind of spirits would be most apt to keep them company? Certainly not spirits of a higher order, who would be as little attracted to them as would be philosophers and men of science among ourselves. Thus, whenever men assemble together, they have around them an invisible assembly, sympathizing with their good or bad qualities, and this as a matter of course, and without any evocation having been made or even thought of. Let us suppose still farther that the human beings thus assembled possess the means of conversing with the invisible beings about them through an interpreter, that is to say, through a medium, and that they make an evocation. What spirits would be most likely to answer to their call? Evidently those who are already present, ready and waiting, and only too glad of an opportunity to talk with them. If in an assembly of such a character, a superior spirit should be evoked, it is possible that he may come and may even give a communication in the shape of good advice. But as soon as he finds that he is not attended to, he retires, as all sensible persons would do in his place, and leaves them to give free rein to their folly. But it is not always enough for a meeting to be seriously inclined in order to obtain high-toned communications. There are men who never smile, but whose hearts are none the purer for this eternal gravity. And it is by purity of heart, more than by anything else, that elevated spirits are attracted. No moral condition excludes spirit communications. But if our moral conditions are bad, we enter into conversation with spirits of a similar badness, who do not scruple to deceive us by flattering our weaknesses or our prejudices in order to lead us astray. From the preceding considerations, we perceive how enormous is the influence exercised by our surroundings on the nature of the intelligent communications we receive. But this influence is not exercised as was formerly supposed, when the world of spirits was comparatively unknown to us. When the communications received by an assembly are in accordance with the opinion of its members, it is not because that opinion is reflected in the medium's mind as in a mirror, but because we all have with us spirits who think as we do and who sympathize with us for good or for evil, as is proved by the fact that if persons who form a circle have the moral force to attract other spirits than those who habitually surround them, the same medium will hold a language altogether different from that which he had previously held, and may even make statements at variance with his usual thoughts and convictions. To sum up, the influence of conditions and surroundings will be favorable in proportion to the similarity of thought and feeling between the members of a circle and the spirits about them, in the love of truth, the purity and elevation of their aspirations, and the sincerity of their desire for enlightenment. Chapter 22. Medianimity of Animals. Can animals be used as mediums? This question has been often asked, and the observation of certain facts appeared to suggest the possibility of an affirmative answer. This opinion being mainly accredited by the remarkable intelligence of some of the creatures of the lower ranges, when trained to perform feats which seem to imply a reasoning cooperation, if not a sort of second sight on their part. We have studied the exhibitions referred to with the greatest care, but although we cannot refuse to admit the possession of a relative intelligence by animals, what we found to be most conclusively proved by their seeming lucidity is the skill and perseverance that must have been bestowed on their training. We have also witnessed feats of conjuring that imitated the facts of somnambulism and second sight so ingeniously as to astonish the uninitiated, but which nevertheless, to the eyes of those who are practically acquainted with somnambulism, showed an egregious ignorance on the part of the conjurers of its most elementary conditions. The evidences of artifice afforded by the exhibitions of trained animals, birds, and even insects do not, however, dispose of the question we are considering. For just as the tricks of sham somnambulism prove nothing against the existence of the somnambulic state, so the fact that the feats just referred to are merely mechanical and are not the result of the faculties of second sight or of reason proves nothing against the possibility of the existence of those faculties in animals. What we have to ascertain is, therefore, whether animals are capable, like men, of serving as intermediaries to spirits for the transmission of intelligent communications. It might seem at first sight only reasonable to suppose that a living being endowed with a certain portion of intelligence would be better adapted for this purpose than an inert body without vitality of its own, such as a table, for example, but this is not the case. The question of the medianimity of animals is completely settled in the following dissertation by a spirit whose profundity and sagacity our readers have already been enabled to appreciate by preceding quotations. In order to perceive the full force of his reasoning, we must bear in mind the explanation given by him of the part performed by the medium in the transmission of communications. Dissertation on the question of the medianimity of animals, dictated spontaneously after a discussion of the subject at a meeting of the Parisian Society of Psychologic Studies. I am about to address you on the question of the medianimity of animals, brought up and affirmatively argued by one of the most fervent members, who asserts, in virtue of the axiom, "He who can do the greater can do the lesser," that it is possible for us to mediumize birds and other creatures of the animal reign, and to use them as our instruments in communicating with the human race. The argument brought forward by him is, however, purely and simply what your logicians call a sophism. He argues that as we can vitalize inert matter, a table, a chair, a piano, etc., we ought a fortiori be able to mediumize matter already living. This, however, is not and cannot be done. But first of all, let us be agreed as to our facts. What is a medium? The being, the individual, who serves as the connecting link which enables disincarnate spirits to communicate with incarnate spirits, that is to say, with men. Consequently, without a medium, you have no ostensible communication with spirits, whether tangible, mental, scriptive, physical, or of any other kind. There is one principle which I am sure is admitted by all spiritists, that similars act with and as their similars. But what are the similars of spirits, if not spirits, whether incarnate or disincarnate? Your perispirit and ours are derived from the same source, are identical in nature, are, in a word, similars. They possess the properties of assimilation more or less developed and of magnetization more or less vigorous, which enable us, spirits and men, to enter quickly and easily into relation with each other. In fine, what appertains specially to mediums, which constitutes the very essence of medianimity, is a special affinity, and at the same time a force of expansion peculiar to them, which nullifies in them all refrangibility and establishes between us and them a sort of current, a kind of fusion, which facilitates our communications. It is this absence of refrangibility that constitutes a medium, just as it is the refrangibility of their material envelope which prevents the development of medianimity in those who are not mediums. Men are prone to exaggeration in everything. Some, and I am not now alluding to professed materialists, deny that animals have a soul, while others insist upon it that they have a soul like ours. Why will they confound what is perfectible with what is not? Be quite sure of this, that the fire which animates the beasts, the breath which makes them act, move, and speak in their special language, has not, in their present phase of development, an aptitude for mingling, uniting, blending with the divine breath, the ethereal soul, in a word, the spirit which animates the essentially perfectible being, man, the king of terrestrial creatures. Is it not this very quality of perfectibility that constitutes the superiority of the human race over the other terrestrial species? Let us then be distinctly understood that you cannot assimilate to a man who alone is perfectible in himself and in his works any individual of the other races living upon the earth. Is the dog, whose superior intelligence among animals has rendered him the friend and messmate of man, capable of attaining to perfection in himself and of his own personal initiative? No one would dream of making such an assertion, for the dog neither progresses nor makes his fellow dog progress. The best taught dog has always been trained by a master. Ever since the world was made, the beaver has built his hut over the stream according to the same proportions and by the same invariable rule. The nightingales and the swallows have never made their nest otherwise than did their parents before them. A nest of sparrows before the deluge and at the present day is always the same nest, built under the same conditions, with the same interweaving of the same materials gathered in the spring at the season of love. The bees and the ants, in their little household republics, have never varied in their provident habits, propensities, ways, or productions. The spider still weaves his web just as he always wove it at every period of the earth's development. On the other hand, if you look for the leafy huts and rude tents of the early ages of the human race, you will find in their place the palaces and habitations of modern civilization. Tissues of silk and ornaments of gold have taken the place of man's primitive clothing of undressed skins, and evidences of the incessant advance of humanity in every department of progress meet you at every step. From the onward movement of the human race constant, invincible, undeniable, and from the persistently stationary position of the other species of animated beings, you should conclude with me that while certain principles, breath and matter, are common to all that live and move upon the earth, it is none the less true that you alone, you, spirits incarnated in earthly bodies are placed under the action of the inevitable law of progress, which urges you necessarily and forever onward. God has placed the animals by your side as auxiliaries to feed you, to clothe you, to second you, and has given them a certain portion of intelligence because, in order to aid you, they must to a certain extent comprehend you. And their intelligence has therefore been proportioned to the services which they are called upon to render. But in his wisdom, he has not placed them under the same law of progress as yourselves. Such as they were created, such they have remained, and such they will remain until the extinction of their races. It has been said, spirits mediumize inert matter, such as chairs, tables, pianos, etc., and make them move. Yes, we make them move. But as to mediumizing them, no. For I repeat it, no spirit phenomenon can be produced without a medium. What is there wonderful in the fact that we should, with the aid of one or more mediums, make matter move, seeing that it is inert and passive and is therefore fitted, just because it is inert and passive, to obey the movements and impulsions with which we impress it? In order thus to impress it, we require a medium. But it is not necessary that the medium should be present or conscious of our action, for we are able to act with the elements furnished by him without his knowledge and away from his presence, especially in cases of tangibility and carryings. Through the uniting and blending, combining of our fluidic envelope, more imponderable and subtle than the most imponderable and subtle of your gases, with the fluidic but animalized envelope of the medium, which possesses an expansibility and penetrability unimaginable by your gross senses and inexplicable for you, we are enabled to move objects and to break them to pieces, even in uninhabited rooms. Spirits can render themselves visible and tangible to animals, and the sudden terror with which the latter are sometimes seized and for which you can perceive no reason is caused by their seeing one or several spirits bearing ill will towards their owners, or towards some of the persons present. You frequently see horses that will neither go forwards nor backwards, or that rear or shy at some obstacle unseen by you, and which is often a spirit or a group of spirits terrifying the animal, out of malice, or by way of a joke. Remember how Balaam's ass, seeing an angel before her, and frightened at his flaming sword, stood obstinately still, the angel before making himself visible to Balaam, having appeared first to the animal only. But though we can render ourselves visible to animals, we cannot mediumize them any more than we can mediumize inert matter. The conscious or unconscious cooperation of a human medium is always a necessary condition of our intercommunication with men, because for this we require the union of similar fluids, which do not exist either in the animals or in inert matter. The advocate of the idea I am combating says that he magnetized his dog. But what was the result of that magnetization? The death of the dog, for the unfortunate animal died after having fallen into a state of atony and languor, the consequence of his magnetization. By inundating the dog with a fluid of an essence superior to the essence proper to its nature, he killed it, for he acted upon it just as lightning would have done, only more slowly. Therefore, as no assimilation is possible between our paraspirit and the fluidic envelope of animals, properly so called, we should kill them instantly if we attempted to mediumize them. This point being clearly established, I fully admit that there exist in animals various aptitudes, that certain sentiments, certain passions, identical with human passions and sentiments, are developed in them, that they possess consciousness and are affectionate and grateful, or vindictive and full of hatred, according to the way in which they are treated by you. and that those especially that are intended to be the companions or the servants of man have been endowed by God with a capacity for entering into sociable relations with Him, of which the wild beasts of the desert are almost entirely destitute. But between this and the power of serving as intermediaries for the transmission of a spirit's thought, there is a great gulf, the difference of natures. You know that we draw from the brain of the medium the necessary elements for giving to our thought a form that may be visible and tangible for you. It is with the aid of the materials possessed by him that the medium is able thus to translate our thought into human words. But what elements for such translation could we find in the brain of an animal? What animal's brain could furnish us with words, letters, numerals, or signs of any kind, similar to those which are in use among even the most backward of mankind? Still, you may say, animals comprehend men's thoughts. They even divine them. True, trained animals do understand certain thoughts of the people about them. But did you ever know them to reproduce or transmit those thoughts? No. Then you must admit that animals cannot serve as interpreters of the thoughts of spirits. To sum up, ostensible spirit action upon men cannot take place without the conscious or unconscious cooperation of a medium, and it is only human beings, who are spirits like ourselves, that can be used as such by us. The training of dogs, birds, or other animals to perform certain feats is a matter of merely human ingenuity, with which we have nothing to do. Erastes. Chapter 23. Obsession. Among the difficulties incident to practical spiritism, we must place in first rank obsession. That is to say, the empire exercised by certain spirits over certain men. Obsession is always the work of inferior spirits, ambitious of keeping human beings under their power. Superior spirits desire no such tyrannical influence, but content themselves with giving good advice and combating the evil influence of lower spirits. If we fail to heed to them, they retire. But bad spirits, on the contrary, attach themselves obstinately to the human being over whom they obtain a hold, identifying themselves with his spirit and leading him as you lead a child. Obsession presents various characters which it is very important to distinguish, as they result both from the degree of restraint exercised by the obsessor and from the nature of the effects produced by his action. The word obsession is a generic term designating a phenomenon of which the principal varieties are simple obsession, fascination, and subjugation. Simple obsession exists when a maleficent spirit imposes himself on the medium, mixing himself up against the medium's will with all the communications received by the latter, or preventing him from communicating with other spirits by substituting himself for those who are evoked. A medium is not necessarily obsessed because deceived by a lying spirit. The best medium is exposed to such deception, especially in the beginning of his development, while still deficient in experience. Just as among ourselves the most honest men, and especially when they first enter into business, are liable to be taken in by a rogue, a medium may be deceived without being obsessed. Obsession consists in the tenacity of the hold that has been taken by the spirit, rendering it difficult or impossible to get rid of him. In simple obsession, the medium is aware that he has to do with a deceptive spirit, a fact which the obsessor rarely tries to conceal, for he usually does not attempt to hide either his evil intentions or his determination to be troublesome. The medium, in such a case, easily recognizes the deceit, keeps on his guard, and is rarely taken in. This sort of obsession is merely disagreeable, and has no other inconvenience than that of placing an obstacle in the way of the communication which it is wished to maintain with spirits of a higher degree, or with those who are united to us by affection. In this category may be placed all cases of physical obsession, such as the obtrusive and obstinate manifestations of spirits who spontaneously annoy people with the sound of blows and other noises, phenomena of which we have already treated in our chapter on spontaneous physical manifestations. Fascination is a much more serious evil. It is an illusion which is produced by the direct action of a spirit on the medium's thought, and which paralyzes his judgment with regard to the communication he receives. The fascinated medium cannot believe himself to be deceived. The obsessing spirit artfully inspires him with a blind confidence, which prevents him from seeing the absurdity of what he writes, even when this is clear to everyone else. A delusion which may go so far as to make him regard with admiration the most ridiculous nonsense. It would be a serious error to suppose that this species of obsession is confined to mediums who are merely ignorant and wanting in judgment. Intellectual and learned men who are highly intelligent in other respects are not exempt from it, which proves that this aberration is the effect of some exterior action to which they are exposed. We have said that fascination is much more serious than simple obsession, because through the illusion caused by it, the obsessing spirit leads his victim as though he were blind, making him accept the most ridiculous statements and theories as truth, and in some cases, exciting him to actions of the most insensate, compromising, and even dangerous character. The difference between simple obsession and fascination is easily understood, as is also the different quality of the spirits by whom they are produced. In obsession, the spirit who attaches himself to us is only importunate and annoying from his tenacity. He is a being we are impatient to be rid of. In fascination, it is quite otherwise, for in order to compass his ends, the evil spirit must be adroit, cunning, and hypocritical, imposing upon his victim and getting himself accepted with the aid of a false semblance of virtue and a lavish employment of words and phrases such as charity, humility, the love of God, etc., which men are apt to regard as credentials, though the tenor of his communications show a degree of inferiority which only the fascination he exercises over his medium can prevent the latter from perceiving. A spirit of this class therefore dreads the presence of clear-sighted judges who would see through his deceptions, and directs his efforts especially to inspiring his victim with the determination to avoid everyone who would undeceive him. By so doing, he avoids contradiction and is always able to prove himself in the eyes of his unfortunate medium to be in the right. The third degree of obsession, subjugation, is a constraint which paralyzes the will of its victim and makes him act in spite of himself, reducing him to a state of absolute bondage. Subjugation may be moral or corporeal. In the first case, the subjugated medium is often drawn on to do things which are foolish or reprehensible, but which he is deluded into regarding as wise and proper. It is a species of fascination, but one which is exercised on the will as on the mind. In the second case, the spirit acts on the material organs of his victim, provoking involuntary movements or acts, as is shown in the case of writing mediums, by an incessant desire to write, even at the most inopportune moments. We have seen a medium thus enslaved, who for want of a pen or a pencil made movements with his finger as though writing, wherever he happened to be, even in the streets, upon the doors and walls. The corporeal subjugation sometimes goes still further, and forces its victims to do the most extravagant things. We knew a man, neither young nor handsome, who under the influence of an obsession of this nature was constrained by an irresistible impulse to throw himself on his knees before a young girl for whom he felt no admiration and to make her an offer of marriage. At other times he was forced by a violent pressure on his back and loins to kneel down in spite of his strenuous efforts to the contrary, and to kiss the ground in public places and in the presence of the crowd. This man passed for mad among his acquaintances, but most certainly he was not mad, for he was fully conscious of the absurdity of what he was thus made to do against his will, and suffered horribly in consequence. In former days, the term possession was employed to express the empire thus exercised over men by evil spirits, when their influence went the length of producing what appeared to be mental aberration. For us, possession would be synonymous with subjugation. If we do not adopt the term possession, it is for two reasons. First, because it implies a belief that there are beings created for evil and perpetually doomed to evil, whereas there exist in fact only beings more or less advanced, all of whom can improve themselves. And secondly, because the term possession implies the idea of a stranger spirit taking possession of the victim's body by a sort of cohabitation with the spirit of his victim, while in fact the obsessor's action is only one of constraint. The word subjugation expresses our thought perfectly. Therefore, as we hold that no one is possessed, in the common acceptation of the word, there exists for us among the victims of evil spirits only the 3 degrees of the obsessed, the fascinated, and the subjugated. Obsession, as we have said, is one of the worst stumbling blocks of medianimity, as it is also one of the most frequent. We should therefore do our utmost to combat it, for besides the personal annoyances to which it may lead, it is an absolute bar to the reception of truthful communications. Obsession being always the result of restraint, and restraint being never exercised by a good spirit, it follows that every communication transmitted by an obsessed medium is vitiated in its origin and is therefore undeserving of confidence. We may recognize the existence of obsession by the following signs. 1. The persistence of a spirit in communicating, whether he is wanted or not, by writing, sounds, by typology, etc., and his persistence in preventing other spirits from manifesting themselves. 2. The illusion which, notwithstanding the intelligence of the medium, prevents his seeing the falsity or absurdity of the communications which he receives. 3. Belief in the absolute identity and infallibility of spirits, who under respected and venerated names say false and foolish things. 4. The medium's confidence in the praises heaped on him by the spirits who communicate through him. 5. A disposition to shun the presence of those who might give him useful advice. 6. Offense taken at criticism of communications received by him. 7. An incessant desire to write, etc., without regard to time and place. 8. Physical constraint overruling the medium's will and forcing him to speak and to act in spite of himself. 9. Persistent noises and other disturbances around the medium, of which he is at once the cause and the object. On considering the dangers of obsession, some persons may be inclined to ask, is it not a misfortune to be a medium? For is it not this faculty which renders obsession possible? In a word, is not the possibility of obsession a proof that spiritism and medianimity are to be regarded rather as dangers to be shunned than as aids to be desired? Our answer to this query is as follows, and we beg our readers to weigh carefully what we are about to say. It is neither by mediums nor by spiritism that spirits have been created. It is spirits who have made both spiritism and mediums. Spirits being only the souls of men. They have necessarily existed as long as men have existed, and they have consequently at all periods exercised a salutary or pernicious influence on the human race. The mediumnimic faculty of certain human beings is, for spirits, only a means of manifesting themselves. In the absence of this faculty, they exercise their influence all the same but in other ways, more or less occult. It would therefore be an error to suppose that spirits only influence us through verbal, written, or other manifestations. Their influence upon us is perpetual, and those who do not occupy themselves with spirits, or who do not even believe in their existence, are exposed to their influence as all others are, and even more than others because they possess no counterpoise to their action. Medianimity is for a spirit a means of making himself known to men, and as, if he is evil, he is sure to betray himself. However hypocritical he may be, we may safely assert that medianimity, so far from bringing us under the power of our enemy, enables us to meet him face to face, if we may so express ourselves, and to fight him with his own weapons. In the absence of medianimity, our enemy acts against us in the dark, and under cover of his invisibility, he can do us, and often does, much evil. To how many evil deeds are not men urged to their sorrow by evil spirits? Deeds which they might have avoided had they possessed the means of enlightenment as to the nature of the impulsions to which they were yielding. The incredulous know not how truly they speak when they say of a man who goes obstinately astray, that man's evil genius is urging him to his ruin. A knowledge of Spiritism, then, so far from giving power to bad spirits, must eventually destroy their influence over men by giving to everyone the means of guarding himself against their suggestions, so that he who falls under their yoke will do so with his eyes open and will have only himself to blame for his folly. We may set it down as a general rule that whoever has evil spirit communications or manifestations of any kind is under an evil influence, and this influence would affect him whether he were a medium or not, and whether he believed in Spiritism or whether he did not. Medianimity gives a man the means of assuring himself in regard to the nature of the spirits who act upon him and opposing them if they are evil, and he does this the more successfully in proportion as he understands the motives from which spirits act. To sum up, the danger is not in Spiritism, since Spiritism enables us, on the contrary, to guard ourselves against a danger to which, without it, we are incessantly exposed while unaware of its existence. The real danger consists in the propensity of many mediums to believe themselves to be the sole instruments of superior spirits, and in the fascination which blinds them to the absurdity of the statements made through them. But those who are not mediums may incur the same danger, as is shown in the following illustration. A man has, without knowing it, a secret enemy, who spreads abroad the vilest calumnies against him. He finds his affairs going wrong, his friends forsaking him, and his domestic happiness destroyed, for being unable to discover the hand which stabs him. He cannot defend himself, and he succumbs to his unseen foe. But the latter at length writes him a letter in which, despite his cunning, he betrays his identity and his machinations. And, as he is now discovered, his victim is enabled to confound him and regains his former position. Such is the part played by evil spirits, and such is the aid which is given to us by Spiritism in discovering and defeating their attacks. The motives of obsession vary according to the character of the obsessing spirit. It is sometimes a vengeance exercised on someone by whom he may have been wronged during his last earthly life, or in some previous existence, but it is frequently prompted by the mere desire of doing harm. Some spirits, having suffered, like to make others suffer, and take pleasure in tormenting them. Others again are amused by the impatience they excite, but usually become tired of plaguing those who bear their teasings patiently. There are spirits who persecute men through sheer hatred and jealousy of what is good, for which reason they often select the best people for their attacks. One of these attached himself, like a limpet, to an excellent family of our acquaintance, whom he had not, however, the satisfaction of deceiving. When questioned as to his motives for attacking worthy people rather than bad ones like himself, he answered, "Bad people do not make me envious." Other bad spirits are moved by a cowardly desire to take advantage of the moral weakness of persons whom they know to be incapable of resisting them. A spirit of this class, who has subjugated a young man of very limited intelligence, when questioned by us as to his motive for making choice of such a victim, replied, "I have an itching to torment someone. A reasonable person would drive me away. I stick to this idiot because he has not the active virtue that would enable him to withstand me." There are obsessing spirits who are not malicious, but they are usually puffed up with the pride of superficial knowledge. They have their own ideas, their scientific and social theories, their moral and religious philosophies. And being desirous to inculcate their opinions, they seek out mediums who are sufficiently credulous to accept them blindfold, and whom they fascinate in order to prevent their discriminating between error and truth. These are the most dangerous of all obsessors, because sophistry is easily employed, and with its aid, the most ridiculous fancies are made to appear worthy of credit. While such sophists, aware of the influence exerted by great names, make no scruple of assuming or borrowing the very highest that may suit their purpose. They seek to impose on those who listen to them by the employment of pompous and pretentious language, bristling with technical terms or set off with charity, morality, etc. They are careful to give no evil counsels, because to do so would be to betray themselves and to defeat their object, instead of which they take care that those over whom they hold sway may always be able to uphold them by saying, "You see that they never inculcate anything evil." Nevertheless, morality with such spirits is only a passport. In reality, they care nothing about it, their sole aim being to dominate and to impose their ideas, however extravagant, on all whom they can induce to listen to them. Theorizing spirits are generally wordy and prolific, and strive to make up for deficient quality by superabundant quantity. Nothing pleases them more than to make their mediums write voluminous books, as crude and hollow as pretentious, but which happily do but little mischief, being usually unreadable. Writings such as those now alluded to are, however, to be regretted, for the extravagances and eccentricities with which they usually abound not only shock common sense, but are calculated to do harm both by giving to inquirers a false idea of spiritism, and also by furnishing opponents with a handle for turning it into ridicule. As previously remarked, it often happens that a medium can only communicate with one spirit, who attaches himself to him and answers for all the other spirits evoked by those who make use of him as such. This is not always an obsession, for it may arise from a defect in the flexibility of the medium, or a special affinity between him and the spirit who thus attaches himself to him. There is no obsession, strictly speaking, excepting when a spirit imposes himself on a medium and drives other spirits away by an act of his will, which a good spirit never does. The method of combating obsession varies according to the character it assumes. There is no real danger for any medium who is fully aware that he has to do with a deceptive spirit, as is the case in simple obsession. It is merely a very disagreeable thing for him, but it is precisely because it is disagreeable to him that the obsessor is obstinately bent on maintaining his hold upon him. There are two plans that may be followed in such a case. First, to prove to the spirit that he will not be allowed to gain the mastery. And secondly, to tire him out by showing a patience greater than his persistence. If the obsessor sees that he is losing his time, he will usually end up by abandoning his attempts. But this is not always sufficient, and the annoyance may have to be borne for a long time, for some spirits are terribly tenacious, and to such months and years are of little consequence. The medium who finds himself obsessed should make frequent and fervent appeals for assistance to his guardian angel and to all spirits who are in sympathy with him, and the obsessing spirit must be diverted from his purpose by remonstrance, good counsels, benevolence, and prayer. If really perverse, he will, at first, mock at these efforts, but by persistent action of this character, he will at length be brought to yield and to amend. Obsession, therefore, affords an opportunity for missionary work that is often painful, fatiguing, and even repulsive, but that is all the more meritorious on that account, and that is also eventually productive of the liveliest satisfaction as the accomplishment of a work of charity, the bringing back of a perverted brother into the path of purification and of progress. It is well to suspend the exercise of medianimity when we perceive we are being acted upon by an evil or unreasonable spirit, and thus to show him that he is not to have the pleasure of absorbing our attention uselessly. The writing medium is able to break off connection with a troublesome spirit by merely abstaining from writing. But the auditive medium is not so fortunate, for in his case the obsessing spirit sometimes pursues him incessantly, and even assails him with vile and disgusting utterances against which the unhappy victim of this species of obsession has no means of stopping his ears. It is greatly to be regretted that any human being should find amusement in the ribald jests of spirits of this description, and should even laugh at their folly and urge them on, instead of imposing silence on them and endeavoring to bring them to a better mind. But counsel is of little use to those who are bent on drowning themselves. There is, then, in simple obsession much that is disagreeable, but no danger for any medium who does not abdicate the use of his reason and common sense, because such a one will not allow himself to be deceived or misled. There is, then, in simple obsession much that is disagreeable, but no danger for any medium who does not abdicate the use of his reason and common sense, because such a one will not allow himself to be deceived or misled. But when mediums are fascinated, it is altogether different, for in that case, the authority usurped by the obsessing spirit over his victim has no limits. The only thing to be done for a fascinated medium is to try to convince him that he is deceived, and to bring him back to a state of simple obsession. But this is never an easy matter, and is sometimes impossible. The ascendancy of the obsessing spirit may be so complete as to render the fascinated medium deaf to every argument, and even to persuade him, when he ventures on some assertion contradicted by positive science, that science is in the wrong. As we have already pointed out, the fascinated medium generally receives advice with a very ill grace. He is irritated by criticism, and takes a dislike to those who do not share his infatuation. To doubt the superiority of his beloved spirit is a sort of sacrilege in his eyes, and that is just the state of mind which the obsessor desires to maintain on the part of his victim. A victim of this nature exercised over a medium of our acquaintance an extraordinary fascination. We evoked the obsessing spirit, and after some shuffling, seeing that he could not deceive us as to his identity, he confessed that he was not the spirit whose name he had assumed. To our questions as to why he thus deceived the medium, he replied in these words, which show clearly the character of this class of spirits. I sought someone whom I could lead by the nose. I have found him, and I shall stay with him. But if we help him to see clearly, he will drive you away. We shall see, was the defiant reply. As none is so blind as he who will not see, The best plan, when we find it impossible to open the eyes of a fascinated medium, is to leave him to his illusions. The sick man cannot be made whole as long as he hugs his disease and refuses to follow the wise advice that would cure him. Corporeal subjugation often deprives its victim of the energy necessary for getting the better of his obsession. In such a case, therefore, the intervention of a third person is absolutely necessary, and it may be exercised by mesmerism or by the mere force of will. When the cooperation of the person obsessed cannot be had, the magnetizer must endeavor to obtain an ascendancy over the obsessing spirit. But as this ascendancy can only be a moral one, it can only be gained by a person who is morally superior to the obsessor, his power over whom will be in proportion to the degree of his superiority. It was a moral elevation of Jesus that gave him boundless power over what in his day were called devils, that is to say, evil and obsessing spirits. We can only, in regard to this matter, give general counsels, for no physical action is of any use. There is no exorcism, no sacramental formula that can drive away obsessing spirits. The party obsessed is sometimes wanting in fluidic force, and in such a case the action of a good mesmerizer may prove a useful aid. It is always well, in regard to the cure of obsession, to take counsel of a superior spirit or of the guardian angel of the person obsessed through a good medium. The moral imperfections of the obsessed are often an obstacle to their deliverance, as is seen in the following remarkable example, which we here bring forward as being of general application. Several sisters had been subject for many years to depredations of a very unpleasant nature. Their clothes were constantly scattered about in every corner of the house, and sometimes even upon the roof. They were cut and torn, holes were made in them, no matter how carefully they had locked them up. These ladies, living in a little provincial town, had never heard of spiritism, and their first idea was naturally enough that they were the victims of some malicious practical joke. But the persistency of the annoyance, notwithstanding the precautions they adopted in the hope of putting a stop to it, soon showed them that this could not be the case. It was not until the annoyance had gone on for some years that, having heard of spiritism and spirits, they addressed us on the subject in the hope of learning the cause of the damage thus caused to them and the means of preventing its reoccurrence, if possible. There could be, to our mind, no doubt about the cause of the annoyance, but to suggest a remedy was a more difficult matter. The spirit who manifested his presence by such acts was evidently animated by a sentiment of hostility, and in fact such was found to be the case when we evoked him. He showed himself, moreover, to be exceedingly perverse, and inaccessible alike to persuasion and counsel. Prayer, however, appeared to exercise a salutary influence over him. But after a short respite, the depredations complained of began again. We subjoin the communication of a superior spirit consulted by us in regard to these persecutions. The ladies thus tormented must entreat their protecting spirits not to abandon them, but they must also examine their consciences and ask themselves whether they have always practiced neighborly charity. I do not mean the charity which gives alms, but the charity of the tongue. Unfortunately for them, they have not yet learned to restrain that member, and therefore do not deserve the deliverance which they desire from the spirit who torments them, for they are much too fond of slandering their neighbors. The spirit who obsesses them does so out of revenge, for while living he was their drudge, and suffered much through their hardness and their exactions. They have only to consult their memory to see who it is that they have to do with. Nevertheless, if they set themselves resolutely to amend what is amiss in their daily life, their guardian angels will come back to them, and their presence will suffice to drive away the revengeful spirit whose power is principally in connection with one of them, her guardian angel, having been forced to leave her by her indulgence in reprehensible acts and thoughts. Let these ladies pray fervently for all who suffer. Let them practice the virtues required by God from every one according to his condition, and they will be delivered from the obsession that has so long tormented them. On our remarking that these strictures appeared to be rather severe, and that it might perhaps be well to soften them before transmitting them to the ladies, the Spirit added, "It was my duty to say what I have said, and in the way in which I have said it, because the persons in question do not perceive that they make an evil use of their tongues, although they do so habitually and to a deplorable degree. It is therefore necessary to give them a warning that may strike home to them." When this message was given, neither Allan Kardec nor the medium by whom it was written had any knowledge whatever of the ladies to whom it referred, and who lived in a remote country town. But subsequent inquiries showed that its allegations were true, and that its severity was fully deserved. Happily for the parties to whom it was addressed, the lesson it conveyed proved effectual. They renounced the uncharitable habits which had brought them under the power of their obsessor, and were consequently freed from their obsession. From the foregoing we learn a very important lesson, that our moral imperfections bring us under the power of obsessing spirits, and that the surest method of getting rid of these is to attract good spirits to us by the practice of virtue. Good spirits are more powerful than bad ones, and their will suffices to keep off the latter. But they only assist those who second the action of their will by the efforts they themselves make for their own amendment. When no such efforts are made, good spirits retire, and their withdrawal leaves the field free to the evil ones, who thus become, in certain cases, instruments of punishment, the higher spirits allowing the lower ones to act for the accomplishment of this end. We must not, however, attribute to direct spirit action all the disagreeable things that may happen to us, for our annoyances are often the consequence of our carelessness and improvidence. A farmer once got somebody to write to us for him, stating that he had been subject for 12 years to every sort of mishap with the animals on his farm. All his cows died, or their milk dried up, and all kinds of accidents befell his horses, sheep, and pigs. He had made many efforts to put a stop to these troubles by prayers and devotions continued, according to the Catholic usage in such cases, for 9 days at a time, but these had had no effect, nor had his affairs been improved by the numerous masses he had paid for, and all the exorcisms he had had performed by the village priest in the hope of putting an end to his misfortunes. According to the peasant notions, he was persuaded that his animals had been bewitched, and as he probably supposed us to possess a conjuring power greater than that of the village priest, he begged for our advice. Here is the advice we obtained for him from the spirit whom we consulted in regard to this matter. The sickness and mortality among the animals belonging to this farmer are due to the fact that his stables, pens, and outhouses are in a foul and unhealthy state, and that he neglects year after year to get them cleaned and made wholesome because that would cost money. We will conclude this chapter by appending, in confirmation of the foregoing statements, the answers given us by spirits to various questions bearing upon the subject we have been considering. How is it that some mediums are unable to rid themselves of troublesome spirits? And how is it that the good spirits whom they call to their aid are not strong enough to drive away the others and to communicate directly with the medium? There is no lack of power on the part of good spirits. In all such cases, the want of power is on the part of the medium, who is not strong enough to second their action. Each medium, in virtue of his particular temperament, enters most easily into certain relationships because his fluid identifies itself with that of one spirit more easily than with that of another. It is this which gives so great a power to the spirits who make a bad use of a medium's fluid. But there are many excellent persons of irreproachable morality who are prevented from communicating with good spirits notwithstanding their excellence. In such cases, the action of evil spirits, if not an expiation, is permitted as a trial. Can you be sure that there is not still some latent impurity in the secret heart of those persons? That pride does not lurk under their seeming excellence? Such testings are intended by showing to the obsessed his weak side, to help him to the acquisition of humility. Can anyone on earth call himself perfect? And are there not always, under the most virtuous exteriors, some hidden faults, some old leaven of imperfection? For example, you say of one who does nothing wrong, who is upright in his social dealings, that he is an honorable and worthy man. But do you know whether the worth of those good qualities is not diminished by secret pride? Whether there may not still be some remains of selfishness in him? Whether he may not be covetous, jealous, bitter, calumnious, or defective in other ways that you do not perceive, because your intercourse with him has not shown you all the innermost recesses of nature? The surest way of combating the influence of evil spirits is to emulate, as far as possible, the nature of good ones. When obsession prevents a medium from obtaining the communication which he desires, is it always a sign of unworthiness on his part? I do not say that it is necessarily a sign of unworthiness, but that it shows the existence of some obstacle, moral or other, to those communications. The medium should therefore try to get rid of that obstacle, which is always in himself. Otherwise his desires and entreaties will be of no avail. It is not enough for a sick man to say to his physician, "Give me health, I would fain be well." The physician can do nothing for him unless he, on his part, consents to follow the necessary treatment. The privation of communication with certain spirits may then be a species of punishment. In some cases, it is a very real punishment, as the possibility of obtaining such communication is a reward that you should strive to deserve. May we not also combat the influence of evil spirits by moralizing them? Yes, people too often fail to attempt this, but it is exactly what they ought to do, for it is frequently a duty laid upon you, and one that should be kindly and religiously accomplished by you. Your influence may bring them to repentance, and thus hasten their advancement. How can a man possess in such cases more influence than is possessed by good spirits? Perverse spirits are nearer to the human beings to whom they come with the desire to torment them than to the superior spirits whom they do their utmost to avoid. When in their approach to the former they meet with those whose influence is calculated to make them better, they at first refuse to listen to them and only laugh at their remonstrances. But if the human being persists judiciously in his effort to act upon them, they usually end by following his counsels. Elevated spirits are too far above them. They dazzle and terrify them by their splendor. Assuredly, men have not more power than the higher spirits, but the influence of men is more consonant with their nature, and superior spirits, on seeing the ascendancy that a man may exercise over inferior spirits, recognize still more clearly the solidarity which exists between heaven and earth. A man's ascendancy over spirits is always in proportion to his moral superiority. He can have no mastery over superior spirits, nor over those who, without having arrived at that grade, are good and kind. But he can master all spirits who are inferior to himself in moral advancement. Could corporeal subjugation be carried to the extent of producing madness? Yes, a species of madness of which the cause is unknown to the world in general, but which has no connection with ordinary madness. Among those who are treated as mad, there are many who are only subjugated, and whose treatment ought to be exclusively moral. But such patients are often made really mad by the physical treatment to which they are subjected. When your doctors understand Spiritism, they will be able to distinguish between these two classes of madness, and they will then cure many more patients than they now do. What is to be thought of those who, fancying they see danger in Spiritism, believe they can prevent it by interdicting spirit communications? It might be possible to prevent individuals from seeking to hold communications with spirits, but it would not be possible to prevent spontaneous spirit manifestations from occurring to these very persons. For spirits can neither be suppressed nor prevented from exercising their occult power. Those who should attempt such a repression would be like children who put their fingers into their eyes and suppose that no one can see them. It would be folly to try to suppress what brings with it such great advantages, merely because unwise people may make a bad use of it. The best way to prevent the inconveniences that may result from Spiritism among those who do not understand it is, on the contrary, to let it be universally known and understood